Today I'm fishing into an estuary with tide going out. So that tide plus the river flowing out towards the ocean will be in full force. There's also a lot of weed in there. I'll show you the techniques I use to keep the weed away from your bait so the fish have the best chance of taking it. Now the way that I've set this up, I've got my burley bomb, if you like, here, and I've got the burley pressed really hard onto the base. So I do it two times. I press it on really hard onto the base. There's some little coils in there that the burley sort of holds onto. And then the rest of the frame it holds a bit looser. So I've actually done it twice. I press it really hard onto the internal coil. Then I put an outer layer, not as hard, onto the frame. And the one on the frame, the burley on the frame, comes off relatively quickly, so that's spreading downstream. The one on the internal coil inside holds on longer. So what I've got is I've got some burley coming off going downstream, and I've got the other burley on the coil holding in there so that it's just filtering off burley very slowly. It lasts a longer, and of course my bait is just below that. Now, as I cast out here, I actually have to cast a fair way out. I'm trying to get out into the central stream. So the bank goes down fairly gradually and then goes into the main body of the river, which is deeper. I'm trying to get into that main channel. That's why I have to cast a fair way out. Look at that. And that's happening within about a minute of it going in, so it's really...
The weed had been really bad, so I had to do something to try and keep my bait clear so that wasn't getting caught up. But always casting to the same spot when you're using burley is really important. If you do that, then you're more likely to get the fish biting pretty quickly, especially after you've had a few casts. So with the setup that I had with the burley, what I was doing was getting a lot of burley flowing into the water stream. So fish were waiting for me. So if I got bites straight away, that was pretty easy. The real challenge came when I was trying to keep the hook free of weed. But what I found is if I lengthened the trace from where it joined at the swivel down to the hook, if I made that longer, what was happening was that most of the weed was actually catching around the burley cage and around the burley. That didn't matter because the burley would still filter downstream. If the trace wasn't long enough, what was happening is the weed, the long stringy weed, would dangle from the wire burley cage down over the top of the bait. By lengthening that, the bait was free for longer, and because the burley was working so well, at least the fish were around, so I got an extra couple of minutes before the bait got covered.
Cast into my spot.
One thing was for sure, if you cast out and put your rod into the rod holders or just put it down without holding it, there were certainly bites happening, but because they happened so quickly, you didn't really get a chance to strike into them. So you only got a couple of movements on the rod before you actually could strike into the fish. They weren't hooking themselves on the day, so you actually had to really strike into them and set that hook. And that wasn't an easy job either. The important thing was to keep tension on the line as you actually wound them in and to then get them out. I found I was winding pretty fast at times to pull them through the water because if I left any slack in the line at all, they would tend to get off. So even when I did all of that, got them out of the water, ready to take off the hook, I found that some of the fish were just so lightly hooked that they were even getting off at that point. Putting the burley onto the burley cage couldn't be easier. All I was doing was dropping my wireframe burley cage into my burley bag. So this is the powdered burley that has been mixed up with water so that it's damp. And then all I'm doing is pressing on the first layer. I press on very hard onto so that it goes onto that coil. And then the next part of it, the outer, I push on reasonably hard, but not too hard. I want that to come off. And then you've got this ball of burley that floats downstream and brings the fish up to your bait. After casting in a number of times, I clearly had enough burley floating down river so that it was drawing the fish up. So at times I felt that the fish were waiting because after casting it didn't really take long to get those bites, but I had to hold the rod. Every time I put it into the rod holder, I'd see the rod tip move and then it would stop. and I wouldn't get the fish. Sometimes they'd take the bait, or sometimes they weren't taking a mauled bait. But by holding the rod either high or sometimes low so I could sit down, I was able to strike into them. By striking into them, keeping tension on the rod and on the line, I got probably about 60% of the fish in. But as I said before, sometimes if I didn't strike well enough, the hook wasn't properly into the fish's mouth and I was dropping a few fish. So sometimes I drop them before I pick them out of the water, and sometimes they just sort of get off as I was trying to pull them off the hook. I kept up a steady pace of casting in fairly regularly because I wanted, while the bite session was on, while the fish were biting, I wanted plenty of burley in the water to try and attract those fish and hook into them. And look, that was working first thing in the morning. I started the session with size 2 hooks and a piece of pilchard, small cube. They were pulling that off. I went down to a 6, then an 8, and then finally down to a size 10, which was the only size hook that I could catch these fish on. But of course, when I got down to the smaller hooks, I wasn't quite getting the right hook hold, and therefore I was losing quite a few fish. Even when I get them in close, they get off like this. Mullet weren't the only fish biting on the day. There's also trevally and tailor biting. I got those earlier that morning with bigger hooks, but they certainly didn't bite for long, and then it was the mullet that came in. But the whole process worked really, really well.
If you've enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. And for any of the gear and tactics I'm using, go to my website, howtofish.com.au. See you next time.